Welcome, everyone. I'm Stacey Harris. I'm the Chief Research Officer for Sapient Insights Group, and I am very excited today to invite you to our Talking HR Insights podcast because we have a wonderful guest today, Kent Plunkett, who's the CEO of Salary.com, who has been in the industry for 11 years. You've ran and owned the Salary.com organization, but you've been managing and an entrepreneur in the HR technology space for years. I think you call yourself a serial entrepreneur, Ken. We're really excited to have you tell us a little bit more about what's happening in the space around compensation management, the market, how it's going to be changing, how we should be looking at some of the federal guidelines and regulations that are coming down. But before we do that, I'm really excited. You run Salary.com for those of you who might not know Salary.com. They are a very large compensation management organization. Over 30,000 people participate in your survey every year. You have over 8,000 organizations who send access to your compensation management tools and surveys. But most people, I don't think, realize that not only are you CEO of that organization, but you've got amazing background, both from an educational perspective, lots of Harvard Business MBAs, and you've got an economic and government degree from Georgetown University. Those are pretty impressive. But my most favorite thing on your bio today was that you are certified compensation professional from the World at Work. Most CEOs don't have that kind of on the ground relationship with the kind of work that they're doing in the organizations that they have put together. Can you say hello to our audience and maybe talk a little bit about how did you get into this compensation world and where do you think it's heading from a big picture perspective?
Great. Well, Stacey, first of all, let me say thank you very much for having me on your show. I'm very pleased to be here. You are well known as one of the most prepared analysts in the HR tech space. And, I think your surveys are long enough to back up that resume. But, you do a great job covering space for a very long time. And really pleased to have somebody who also shares a compensation professional background in the conversation. And thank you for having me. Yeah, I think the CCP designation and studying the art and the science of compensation is very relevant for today's HR generalist, as well as for younger compensation professionals starting out. I think that the credentialing process has probably needs some updating, which World at Work is doing a strong effort around. But people should be prepared to have the discussion about compensation. Our view is the discussion about compensation is the critical piece of the employee-employer relationship. It's the heart of the contract of the deal. There's a lot of talk about the other elements of the relationship, and the history of the relationship between employees and employers has evolved. Going back to the 50s and lifetime employment, and then moving into the 70s where things really became about pay for performance into the 80s. And then performance management really and goal setting came about, and that became a really big trend in the 90s and into the beginning of this decade. This millennium. And now it's much more of a balanced scorecard approach to what is the contract, and it does include things like compensation, but it also includes opportunity. What's my opportunity for career growth and career progression? It includes your environment and your culture at your office. Like, how do I fit? And finally, it goes to leadership. Is it a leadership that is convinced that lifetime learning is important? They're going to provide me those opportunities to develop. Is it a leadership that inspires me? Is it a mission that makes me feel like I'm giving back to the world? And so now you've got to kind of take compensation, opportunity, of the organizational culture and the leadership, and combine all four of those kind of metrics to decide what is the heart of your employee value proposition and how are you going to communicate that. And compensation still is the majority of that. And so we think that understanding compensation is extremely important to the overall mix. More specifically, what a CCP will help you with is understanding, am I paying people in a way that is internally equitable and externally competitive? And what does that mean? So in the US, we primarily do something called market pricing. And in market pricing, you would use a single source of data, which used to be taboo, but is now much more prevalent. Or I'll use multiple sources of data to price a job. And by using multiple sources of data, that usually means a regression data set, like our comp analyst data set, would be a regression data set that would study lots of surveys and lots of data and come with an opinion about pay. And you might add to that 1, 2, or 3 survey sources, which also have data from jobs collected from HR professionals who are sharing their payroll data in a survey. And you take the 3 different sources and you average and weight and tweak and adjust until you come up with a view as a compensation professional as what is a fair pay for that job. And that process called market pricing, which is what's prevalent in the US, is super important for reasons of attracting and retaining your workforce. And compensation is at its core about the deal between the employee and the employer and attracting and retaining that talent so you can get the right performance out of your workforce for the company.
Wow, what a great explanation of sort of the role of both compensation inside of organizations in the deal and for the professional who runs that, right? I mean, you just mentioned a very scientific process that requires not only data, but an understanding of how you run algorithms and how you run statistics across that data. But you also are talking about a bit of art, right? I mean, this is something we hear all the time from comp analysts, is that, you also have to understand what the relationship is that the company has with the employee, right? And what that culture looks like. And you mentioned all of that in a single role in our organization that oftentimes is not well understood or even known about, except by the few people who get a chance to interact with the comp analyst. So what a wonderful explanation, and how great of you to sort of think about how that connects to the broader HR conversation. I don't know how many times I'll talk to HR and their first focus is, well, the comp department didn't give me the rate I wanted, right? Like it's the problem. It's the salary range, right? And I think we know, from what we're seeing in the market that that's not actually the case. 1/3 of our research respondents to our annual HR systems survey have a CCP designation and behind their name. And it just blows me away that I think that particular role within organizations, how much it has an impact on our retention, as you mentioned, how much it has an impact on our culture, and how much it has an impact on what the board is deciding to do, or an executive level, or our finances in the organization. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you actually a little bit about today is beyond through the compensation journey that you had, is to talk a little bit about where we think compensation is heading for the market. The current sort of impact that we're seeing is that with the COVID pandemic putting all of us in probably one of the most difficult years and economic challenges we've had in the market, there has been a lot of things that have come out of it that have just changed how we think about work altogether. Our data show that 35% of organizations, even as of last year, felt that they were going to be keeping 50% or more of their employees in a work at home environment or work from anywhere environment. That's up from 6% in the previous sort of like before the post-pandemic environment, right? 35% are going to be keeping 50% or more of their workforce in a work at home environment. You guys just recently did a survey that similarly, I think, found not only are we seeing more companies planning to do the work from anywhere, but that employees are really demanding it. And this, I think, is going to change how we think about compensation in the market, right? Can you share some insights on how you believe that the work from anywhere push is going to impact organizations' compensation conversation a little bit?
Sure. I think let me first address some of the numbers around work from home and then the compensation implications, if I might. So, we just completed a survey and we were fortunate to have both audiences. So we were able to survey over 700 companies and over 500 consumers and employees and get their views. And there's definitely some disconnects and some gaps. So firms have been planning on bringing people back to the office, but almost 50% of the employees we survey want to stay work from home permanently. Wow. And bringing them back to the office, substantial portions of them will change jobs to a job where they can work from home going forward. And that is going to be the bugaboo in people's plans to bring people back to the office. There's certainly going to be a percentage of employees that are interested in it. So almost 45% of employees were interested in a hybrid model where they were in the office 2 or 3 days a week and home the other days. And that, I think, is what's going to end up being prevalent because I think it's it should be a reasonable ask and not one that pushes someone to leave the company. There's going to be a significant diehard set of workers who probably made up the population that became gig workers in the last 20 years that are now going to say, I want the flexibility of working from home like a gig worker, but I'm okay to do that inside of a large organization. So I think we're going to see that HR is going to go from only 5% of people in our survey said they were willing to allow the majority of their workers to work from home permanently. That 5% is going to balloon to a much, much bigger number as those conversations with employees begin to meet the test. And I think probably the timing of the survey is probably, HR is not quite caught up to the new reality. And I think that HR is, by its nature, properly responsive and monitoring and measuring employee sentiment. And I think that 5% number will change radically over even the next 90 days.
I really think that one of the things you guys found in your survey is not only this disconnect between companies kind of think, oh, we're going to bring most of our employees back, but the employees are saying, no, I want to work hybrid. But they're also saying, I want to work someplace and I don't want you to sort of judge my salary based off of where I'm at any longer, right? Like, I don't know how many people realize how much where they live impacts their salary range. Can you talk a little bit about this? I mentioned this in an earlier podcast I did with a global audience, and there were people who were kind of amazed by how different the salary could be if you lived in the Midwest of the US versus London versus Dubai. How are we going to see that change for organizations?
So let me start by pointing out something that's going to be interesting for compensation professionals and for HR generalists who are responsible for compensation in their organization. The first thing is we've seen a significant movement by companies with fewer than 200 employees and even fewer than 100 employees. They are feeling the need and the drive to do compensation work even before the pandemic and accelerating in the pandemic. Part of that is because 80% of the companies that we talk to say they're hiring. Mm-hmm. Yeah, part of that's probably a response to either cutting back a little bit during the pandemic or not hiring aggressively until the pandemic resolves, so they're a little bit behind. But another part of it is, there's a bunch of companies out there that are doing well in this environment. But what's really important is more and more of your peers in HR and in comp are now needing to get not just one local survey for one local market, they now need national data because they don't know where the next candidate for that job or the next person that works for them in their company are now going to say that they're going to live. And they need that data. So we are seeing a significant increase in people looking at databases like Comp Analyst, which are broad-based regression and give you a market pricing in every zip code. And we're seeing more demand for surveys where people are increasingly wanting more granular data in different markets. So the response for comp people is I need more data. And so that is something that I would recommend that all comp people and all HR generalists look at in their budget this year is like, you should be acquiring more data because your competitors are acquiring more data. And so to stay competitive, you've got to be up on the data. And that's one of the pressures of having people who now, used to be a local company, now you're national in scope for your employee coverage. And that's without getting into the payroll and tax implications of having people in different jurisdictions. But what are the compensation implications? Well, the first implication is super clear, and we've had this view for a while. If you work for a company that's in San Francisco and you want to move to Montana, you are not going to easily accept a pay cut for that relocation if you don't change your job. What is going to happen, in our view, what we're hearing is that HR is probably going to treat your comp ratio, your pay relative to market, as an overpay when it looks at your compensation. So future raises are going to be smaller and promotion opportunities might be scarcer for you. But what we're seeing in the data is that people value the flexibility on where they live and the extra work-life balance that comes from not commuting at 20% or more of their compensation package. So the value is there for the consumer. The job seeker, or the employees just aren't willing to put it on the table for the company they work for now.
Yeah.
What that does mean, though, is that people aren't going to move back to protect pay. When they move jobs and move companies, what companies are also doing is they're saying, we're not going to disrupt our employee base by forcing a pay cut on them. But when they move jobs, we are going to, and when we have new employees coming in, we're going to price them in many cases against that local pay market. So if you switch jobs, or if you're being promoted or moving across an organization, you're not likely to see a pay cut, but you might not get the same raise that you would get if you were in a more expensive locale. So I think it's going to be interesting because there are more opportunities for you to switch jobs if you work from home, because your job market is anyone who hires nationally. On the other hand, onboarding and getting to know people and feeling secure in that new job is going to be even more difficult, because onboarding is more difficult for remote people.
Yeah.
So I'm going to argue that there's actually going to be less turnover once you get through an initial surge. Because I think just like in the pandemic, people didn't switch jobs easily, right? They were like, no, I'm good. I think if you are working from home and you are in a good company and you're in a good spot and you've got that extra 20% cushion where you feel like you're really well paid for where you're living, there's actually going to be maybe some more baby boomer generation-like stability in rapid transitions and kind of less millennial, I'm going to switch jobs every 3 years type of behaviors. I think it might actually settle out a little bit. If you want to switch jobs, it's going to be even easier to get a job. So that's the other side of it. So for an organization that doesn't treat you well, or a boss that you don't get along with, you might say, well, I'm not going to hang out in this job working from home. I'll take the onboarding risk because I already know what I have here and I can do better. So there will be a lot of pressure on still on employee engagement, and still on, can you train your managers to be good managers of other people? And that's not going to change.
Yeah, you bring up such a great conversation about the fact that, sort of thinking a little bit more strategically about this compensation conversation, instead of just saying, we're going to have a policy that's going to go across the board for everyone, and this is how it works, right? I've talked to a couple of people who have had that happen to them, where they have had their salaries decreased, and that has made them very unhappy, right? But 4 million people here in the United States voluntarily quit their jobs in April. That's the largest number since the Labor Department has been actually tracking that number in December of 2000, right? So we know, I think you're right, that we're in this huge surge right now where organizations and people are both saying we need to get calibrated. Whether that will balance out, I think you've got some good insight into what you expect to see maybe in the next year, because you're seeing what organizations are actually doing with their compensation right now and how they're handling that, which maybe is just a clue. Anybody who's not thinking about it right now, you might want to put it on your list. But one of the things you haven't talked a lot about is the skills conversation, right? So I want to get paid fairly for whatever skill I have, no matter where I live, right? And I want it to be an equitable payment based on, everyone gets the same pay. It doesn't matter my race, my gender, my ethnicity, my background. Can you talk a little bit about, what impact, what we're seeing happening in the economy, the focus on pay equity and skill development is going to have with this conversation around compensation? Do you see those things also coming into play?
Well, I think, Stacey, you picked up on a really hot trend that was frankly in place pre-pandemic, which is skills-based pay. And that has been relatively new in the last 5 to 10 years, because historically you paid the position, not the person.
Yeah.
And the position was a benchmark position. It wasn't a heavily customized job description. And so what's happening today is companies, if they even have a job catalog, now those job descriptions are becoming even more specialized, and we're not at competency-driven HR yet. And I think competency-driven HR probably never happens unless it's called skills-based HR, because I think the word competency just hasn't connected with people.
Nobody likes competencies. I love
It's just a hard word. So I think it's going to be skills.
Yeah.
But it's still that's a data-driven path to understanding skills. What has happened is we saw this, and so we went out and built a data set of 27,000 skills differentials in pay. So we studied if you went to Harvard versus you went to BU versus you went to Mass Bay Community College, what is that worth? What is the difference in degree worth? If you have a Oracle certification for Oracle databases, what's that worth relative to a software engineer 3? So we priced all these differentials, and increasingly you're seeing pay differentials and the individual specific skill sets being mapped to a job to create a specialty job description, or actually pricing the individual for certain of the skills they bring and doing a pay differential for that. So I think the compensation data out there, the surveys are a little slower on this because it's much more difficult to do in a survey environment. Our product, which is we have surveys, we also have the regression data sets, and our regression data sets, that's fully in place. So there are pay differentials now for skills. I do believe that there's a major career opportunity for people in the compensation analyst position to be taking over management of the job catalog for their company. It does not have a natural home. Sometimes it's in the OD department and in training and development. Sometimes it's in recruiting. And about half the time we see that it's somewhere around compensation, because compensation is based on job descriptions, of course. And the new HRIS systems like Workday basically say, you start your implementation by getting your job catalog and your job descriptions in proper shape.
Yeah.
That's a major initiative for anybody trying to deploy a new system. And since over 50% of the companies out there are saying they're going to replace their HRIS and ERP within the next 5 to 10 years, that's a number Stacey knows better than I do, actually.
Yes.
That means all those people are going to have to do job description and job architecture work. So we also, shameless plug, we shipped a product called Job Architect a year ago, which has won some big awards for being really easy to use and really a special product in that category, and there's not a lot of software in that category to help companies solve this problem. But I see compensation professionals taking over the job description catalog, maintaining different versions, one for recruiting, one for OD purposes, and eventually, as competency-driven HR becomes skills-driven HR, you're going to start to build all those behavioral indicators and competency definitions into that job model. And that is going to finally form the basic data layer for HR, to which pricing of skills and pricing of the benchmark basic position then attach. And that is, I think, then going to make people analytics actually finally blossom, because you have to have a controlled data governance model and strong backbone of fundamental core HR data to make people analytics really work. So getting your job descriptions in shape should be part of what the compensation professional or the HR generalist who's responsible for comp does in their company. They should be using tools. And once they do that, it's going to unlock your HRIS, it's going to unlock your talent management, and it's going to unlock future things like career planning, career progression, career pathing, people development. It's extremely powerful capability that I think comp has the right lens on that, and eventually unlocks the full promise of people analytics, which is still kind of it's still developing, right?
Yeah. Well, Ken, you just mapped out the picture of how you take skills and skills management to sort of the next level in talent management and business outcomes for an organization, right? So really, to your point, you guys are selling products and you got services and you got tools, but I can't tell you how much our data, I think, validates what you're talking about. Not, whatever tools people are using, right? We found in our data that those organizations who weathered the pandemic the best were those who had in place some level of skills conversation in their organization. They could go and reposition people, think about their salaries and compensation. They knew exactly what ranges they were able to work within, and they were able to make the organization pivot when it needed to pivot. And you can't do that without the data. So I think, your picture of the future fits what we're seeing in the data as a value proposition for organizations. But I do want to get to this really important conversation right now. Our government is making a lot of fundamental decisions about the kind of reporting. SEC's put down new human capital metric reporting. We're seeing a lot of concern about wage inflation in the market right now. We're seeing a lot of new mandates around pay equity and what we should be recording. Tell me a little bit about how you see some of those things coming together and impacting HR and compensation. And do you think we really understand what the next year or two are going to hold when it comes to sort of the fundamental shifts around how that economics are going to work in our markets, basically?
So, HR has really evolved from being a compliance function to one of attraction, retention, engagement, and performance optimization. Attraction and retention are going to be absolutely critical for the next couple of years. And there's a couple of key drivers. The first is the pandemic, where you had kind of a pause. Everybody hit pause for a year and change of their life. And so over 50% of employees surveyed, as much as 50%, and some are like 35, 38, but they're still hugely material numbers, are planning to look for a job this year. That doesn't mean they're going to leave their job, but it means they're going to look. And that ought to scare the heck out of all of us on the HR side, because that just every person that turns over just creates a ton of work and a potential performance lag in the business. And so that's really scary. Also, that much disruption when people are working from home, it's even harder to onboard new people, especially if you have, massive amounts of flight. So there's that, kind of employees looking for something better. I want to change my life. I've got a little scared by the pandemic. Lots of different drivers on people, but they're looking around. The second thing is the government last summer abandoned 50 years of economic philosophy, which was basically, they said, the way that trickle-down economics is really going to work is we have to have beyond full employment before we worry about fighting inflation. And it was really quiet last spring. And it's been kind of getting out there more and more, but it's absolutely something that every comp person, HR person ought to understand, that the Fed and how they do monetary policy has decided that they're going to let inflation roll and they're going to let it spike. And they're going to let substantially more inflation happen because they're worried that they may have been too conservative for the last 50 years and inflicted too much pain on the lower strata of paid employees in the US. Because let's face it, the people that make more money are better situated to survive the economic downturns. And the people who live paycheck to paycheck without a lot of savings, and it's stunning them out, like over 85% of people don't have a month's emergency money saved. It's crazy how exposed people are to the risks and the shocks to the economic system, that the Fed's not going to cause that. They say, we're not going to be the cause of that anymore. We're going to drive for full employment. We're going to drive for allowing higher inflation for periods of time and be more conservative about tapping on the brakes. So then we've had a really good stock market run as a result, and interest rates have stayed low as a result. And employment, there's 9.3 million jobs available out there. That is a stunning amount of job postings of people trying to hire. So when you add all that together, there's really one logical outcome, which is we are seeing wage inflation, and we are seeing wage inflation at levels that exceed what is being reported. And what is being reported, what companies said they were going to do this year is they were going to budget 2.9% for raises. And that's up a little bit, up about 0.5 point. So that's not, it's not crazy. And, historically it bounces between 2.5 and 3. So, and it depends on which survey. Some said 2.6, but I think what we're really going to see this year is a couple of points higher in reality. Whether it shows up in the actual budget allocation numbers, I'm not so sure, but it's going to be in promotions. It's going to be mobility inside the company where people are getting moved ahead maybe earlier than they would have. I think you are seeing the only way that you can fight 50% people going to look for jobs. The government saying we're going to hit the inflation button and let inflation run, and a robust economy which says companies need to hire to grow. The only thing that can happen there is that talent gets bid up, and we're seeing that. So in the restaurant business, wages went up 4.7% in the last 90 days.
Yeah.
That's crazy, 5% in 90 days. In the trucking industry over the last 12 months, a year ago, their pay was 20% less. It's up 20% in a year. So you can't see numbers like that and not have the flow through. So I think anyone that is looking at work from home is going to say, I'm going to have to be really nice to my employees or else they're going to leave. And I better give them pretty good promotions and pretty good raises this year. So I think we're going to see, real wage inflation in the 5 to 7% range. Whether it's actually gets reported as such or not, I don't know. But if I'm running some of the big employers that we talk with, I'm stealing some of that extra net income and pushing it into forecasts for pay raises and promotions.
You're seeing from the inside, I think most people don't realize, like, the kind of data you see every day that crosses your desk is what organizations are actually doing with their compensation. So your perspective, I think, on this is probably really, really solid. And your conversation about inflation, what I understand you saying, I'm not an economist, but what I hear you saying is that they're going to keep those interest rates low, is what the government basically said, which means your house rate interest rates, your interest rates on cars, all those things will continue to stay low. We might see prices increase in things that are directly impacted by salaries, like the cost of food or the cost of gasoline and piping, those type of things. But the wages are going to grow to match that to some extent. And what you're saying is you're seeing that happen. And I think we've been hearing about it in the news, but I don't know that we kind of fundamentally thought about how all those things were connected, right? It's fascinating. And I think it's also powerful for companies to realize that we haven't seen this kind of wage inflation in quite some years. Like, it's been a pretty basic, maybe a 2% increase year over year. It hasn't kept up with general inflation across the board anyway, right? Like pay increases. So this is almost a recalibration of the market. And then what I'm hearing you say, it might even go a little farther than that, right?
I think you're going to have to pay to stay.
Yeah.
And it's going to be, if you're not giving good raises to people are going to say, I'm going to go down the street. There's 9.3 million jobs out there. There's a better job out there with a bigger price tag on it for me. So I think companies are going to have to step up and pay people more to stay put in their jobs this year.
Fair warning to the employers, wherever you're at, right? HR, this is an opportunity to have that conversation that you've maybe been wanting to have. Well, Ken, this has been such a great conversation. I think not only did we talk about sort of where we're seeing sort of the market head, the important role of the compensation analyst and the work they do inside an organization, we're also talking fundamentally about how we're seeing the impact of government decisions impact the compensation decisions that you're having inside of your organization, how you have to really think about that long term. As we sort of wrap up, do you maybe want to give just one last comment to the audience about anything you think they should be thinking about over the next year or two that we haven't talked about, but as a compensation expert in this market, that you think that people aren't really thinking about today? Like what's the next 2 or 3 years look like from a technology and an HR and a compensation perspective?
I actually think it's pretty simple. I think that if you don't really understand compensation, learn more, because there's more to learn. So, and if you are an expert in compensation, learn more about people analytics, about your job catalog. So continue to learn, continue to develop. If you are a small business and you're going to get hit with unwanted turnover rates, I think are going to be north of 20% for the first time in a long time, right? Across all industries. And so you need to go get data and learn how to use that data to understand, how do I attract and retain the talent I need to power my company's operations and to power performance. There's one other place that I didn't touch on yet that I think is going to be really important. I think onboarding of new employees and that onboarding training program that needs to be online. Your career development needs to switch to an online delivery model to support remote work. The days of in-person training are gone. And so that takes a significant commitment. And that's another place that people can add. But really, get your hands on data, start thinking about getting your job descriptions cleaned up and getting your data in order, and be prepared for what's coming next. Because as people compete for talent, people analytics is finally, the enabling technologies are almost there to make people analytics really a much more natural and easy to accomplish goal. And right now it's been difficult and challenging. And while comp people no longer are the folks that we used to kind of say they were the people in the cafeteria, ate lunch together and had pocket protectors back in the 80s and 90s.
You're talking about maybe, yeah.
that was a description of your card carrying ACA compensation. Tomorrow's is a big data person who's in control of the job catalog, understands how to price the skills and how to support recruiting in competing for talent, and is on all the time. And that is almost a consultant inside the organization as opposed to a spreadsheet grinder.
Yeah.
And so as the work gets automated more, the work does get more strategic. But to be more strategic, you have to be a lifelong learner. I would tell comp people and HR generalists to keep pushing the envelope into comp data, into job descriptions, into skills, and in eventually to people analytics.
Oh, yeah. Well, I always tell people, the people who know the most about your organization are your payroll analyst and your comp analyst, and most people don't take much lunch they really need to. So, Ken, this has been such a wonderful conversation. We're talking HR insights here, lots of insights that you've shared. If our listeners want to download the survey that you talked about, I think those are great findings. Where can they find that at? You could give them a quick, would that be at the salary.com website? Would that be the easiest?
Yeah, salary.com website, under the business side with resources.
Okay. And if they have additional questions, I'm sure they can go to that as well. For everyone who's listening, I want to thank you for joining our conversation today. To our audience, thank you for listening. We know it is time out of your day. We hope it's been valuable time. If you have any specific interviews you'd like to hear going forward, please let us know. And if you have any questions about the annual HR System Survey or the work that we're doing here at Sapient Insights, just go to www.sapientinsights.com. So thank you again, Kat. This has been a fabulous conversation. I hope the rest of the market gets to start to see some of the data that you've been sharing today. It's really exciting to see how I think all of the things we've been talking about for the last couple of years are coming together. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Stacey.